Several months later I saw John and Yoko once more, in the lawyer's office, to which John and I had been summoned to sign the divorce papers. John barely looked at or spoke to me throughout the meeting, and when he left the room to go to the loo, Yoko followed him. A few minutes later I went into the corridor with my lawyer for a private discussion, and saw Yoko waiting outside the door to the gents. At that moment John emerged, and as they passed me he said, "See, I don't go anywhere without Yoko." He had agreed that I should have custody of Julian, but asked for regular visits, and I accepted this. However, Julian hadn't seen John since the acrimonious meeting at the house several months earlier, and I had no idea when, if ever, John would ask to see his son. Money was perhaps the toughest issue. My lawyers had told me that on no account should I make contact with John, as that would be collusion. I was put in touch with a top lawyer, who told me I could take John to the cleaners and fight for half his fortune. But I was finding it hard to cope with the cold legal process. I wanted to talk to John, to tell him how much Julian missed him, to sort things out amicably. So I phoned him. "What do you want?" he snapped. "John, I can't bear all the animosity. It's as though we've never loved each other. They want me to take half your money, but I'd rather we talked and sorted it out between us, without any of the legal jargon. There's nothing to talk about. My final offer is £75,000. That's like winning the pools. So what are you moaning about? You're not worth any more." On that definitive note, he hung up. I told my lawyer that I didn't want to go for half John's fortune. I just wanted a fair and reasonable settlement. I couldn't bear the thought of a long-drawn-out battle, or of exposing our marriage to public scrutiny. I just longed to have the whole thing settled. I was asked to draw up an estimate of my weekly expenditure. It came to £76 for clothes, food, entertainment and holidays for Julian and me. Just under £4,000 a year. My assets included £1,000 in the bank, my clothes and a Mercedes car. I had no jewellery of any more than sentimental value. John's assets were submitted at £750,000. Although he was undoubtedly worth far more, he raised his offer to £100,000. This was broken down into £25,000 for a house and £75,000 to support me and Julian until he was 21. Allowing for inflation, it would not be enough to cover even the modest annual expenses I had listed. A further £100,000 was put into a trust fund for Julian. I would be allowed to draw on the interest from this to pay school fees. But withdrawals would have to be approved by John and Yoko, who were the co-trustees with me of the fund. It was also agreed that should John have more children, the fund would be shared equally with them. While I realised that I was lucky compared to most women divorcing at that time, it still hurt to be dismissed so lightly. John was being meaner than I'd ever known him, which baffled me. Typically he was generous to those around him. Why not now to his wife and son? Whatever his reasons, I had no energy for a fight. In so many ways he was no longer the kind-hearted, passionate and witty man I had fallen in love with. Worn down by the miserable business of negotiating through lawyers, and still smarting from John's withering remark about winning the pools, I accepted his offer. Our decree nisi was granted on November the 8th, 1968. As part of the divorce settlement, I had to move out of Kenwood. Of course, it was much too big for me, Mum and Julian, but I hated having to uproot Julian from his home and his school so soon after his dad had left. Saying goodbye to dear Dot and her family was even worse. She had been such a good friend, solid, loyal and reliable, for more than 4 years. We shed a lot of tears and shared a lot of hugs and promised to keep in touch. I bought a house in Pembroke Gardens, round the corner from Kensington High Street, and enrolled Julian at a small private school close by. He wasn't happy. He didn't make friends and never looked forward to going there in the mornings. After a few weeks, I enrolled him at a lovely state school nearby, where he settled in well. Soon after we moved in, Roberto Bassanini, whom I'd been seeing for some time, came to live with us. I asked myself whether I was ready for a new relationship. I knew that I wasn't over John. I was still hurt, frightened and angry, and probably should have spent more time on my own rather than turning to someone else to heal the wounds. But at the time I was drawn to Roberto's warmth and sense of fun. With him, life turned from the black and white of my depressed, lonely days after John to technicolor again. And if I had doubts for myself, I had none for Julian. Roberto's obvious affection for him was a huge attraction. In May 1969, John and Yoko bought Tittenhurst Park, a 26-room mansion in Sunningdale, Ascot, for £150,000. I knew the house, because John and I had been to look at it with the other Beatles couples a year or two earlier. It was beautiful, with extensive grounds, including its own market garden. For a crazy moment, we'd considered buying it and all moving in together, in a kind of Beatles commune. How strange that now it was John and Yoko's home. Soon after they moved in, I received a call from Peter Brown, the Beatles' assistant. John would like to see Julian, Cyn, if it's okay with you. Anthony will call for him on Friday and take him to Tittenhurst for the weekend. It didn't feel very okay, but I agreed. John had been awarded reasonable access to Julian, and I felt it important that Julian saw his father. When I told him about the visit, Julian was excited and a little scared. He'd just turned 6 and hadn't seen his dad in what, to a 6-year-old, must have seemed a very long time. That Friday, Anthony arrived and came in for a cup of tea. It was good to see him. Like Dot, he'd been a real friend. He told me it was just as well that Julian hadn't gone to the Montague Square flat while John and Yoko were there. It was a complete tip, he said. They were doing heroin and other drugs, and neither of them knew whether it was day or night. The floor was littered with rubbish. Couldn't have had a little one there. How are they now? I asked. They're okay at the new place, he assured me. They've sorted themselves out, and it's all fine there. Julian will love it. With these assurances, but many nagging doubts, I sent Julian off, a tiny figure waving to me from his seat next to Anthony in John's enormous car, his little face unsure. I had told him brightly to have a lovely time with Daddy, smiled and waved until the car had rounded the corner, then cried my eyes out. One of the hardest aspects of letting Julian visit John was accepting that Yoko would presumably look after him when he was there. I didn't know what he would make of her cool manner, but in fact he seemed fine with it. Perhaps it was better for him to have a rather distant stepmother than one who was all over him. He never told me that she was unkind in any way, which was a relief. After that first weekend, Peter rang regularly to arrange visits for Julian. Much to my amusement, Julian had started calling Yoko Hokey Cokey. Julian often came home with bizarre descriptions of life at Tittenhurst. Dad and Hokey walked around the house naked, long hair hanging over their faces, which made them look like witches. They ate funny food, all rice and seeds. Yoko had apparently got John onto a macrobiotic diet. Julian was matter-of-fact about these things, as 6-year-olds tend to be, and I was careful never to say anything critical. Meanwhile, Julian thrived on the attention Roberto gave him. For the first time in his life, he had a man around every day, someone who was interested and involved with him, who took him to school in the mornings, helped him with his homework, and played football with him in the park. Julian adored Roberto, and the two were like best friends.